I didn't like it, but it didn't stop me playing on it, you know. I just played the way I played. I play emotionally.
While Ringo Starr is widely known as the easygoing, affable drummer of the Beatles, the steady beat that kept the band together and the one who seemed to rise above the legendary conflicts between his three bandmates, what if a hidden frustration behind that ever-present smile drove him to a breaking point, so much so that he secretly quit the band? This is the authentic narrative of the intense friction that pushed the most agreeable Beatle to his limit, exposing a side of the group that is often overlooked in historical accounts. Was there one Beatle he genuinely couldn't tolerate? The answer is far more intricate and relatable than one might think. To comprehend how the kindest member of the world's biggest band was driven to walk away, we must revisit 1968. The previous year, their manager, Brian Epstein, had passed away tragically. Epstein was more than just their manager. He was the unifying force that held the four of them in harmony. John Lennon later confessed, "I knew we were in trouble then. I was scared. I thought we've effing had it now." Without Epstein's guiding hand, a power void emerged, and their fragile collaboration began to falter. To cope with their grief, they immersed themselves in projects like the chaotic film Magical Mystery Tour and a spiritual retreat to Rishikesh, India. India was intended to be a place of tranquility and creative renewal, and for a time it was. They composed a multitude of new songs, many of which would form the foundation of their next album. However, even in this peaceful setting, the first significant fissure appeared. Ringo left India after just 10 days, uncomfortable with the cuisine and homesick for his children. Paul departed a few weeks later. John and George remained the longest, but also left abruptly. The four Beatles who had arrived seeking unity departed separately. The seeds of discord were starting to take root. Back in London, they channeled this chaotic energy into a new business, Applecore. It was envisioned as an artist-friendly multimedia company, but, in reality, became a financial drain and a tremendous source of stress. Suddenly, the four musicians also had to be businessmen, and the arguments that began in the boardroom started to spill over into the recording studio. The pressure was mounting. The world was expecting a follow-up to the masterpiece Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, but the cohesive unit that created Skate Pepper was no more. In its place were four increasingly isolated individuals. As John later remarked, the breakup of the Beatles can be heard on that album. For Ringo, the calm eye of this storm, the strain was on the verge of becoming unbearable. The recording sessions for what would become The Beatles, universally known as the White Album, commenced in May 1968. From the outset, the atmosphere was different. The camaraderie of the Sgt. Pepper sessions was gone. The new sessions were long, disorganized, and often extended through the night. The band that once operated as a single unit now frequently split, with one Beatle recording in one studio while another worked on an entirely different song in another. Of the album's 30 tracks, only 16 feature all four Beatles playing together. It was less a band making an album and more like four solo artists using each other as a backing group. To understand what was happening, one must comprehend their individual mindsets. At that time, John Lennon was undergoing a significant personal and artistic transformation. He had fallen deeply in love with Yoko Ono, and for the first time, an outsider was permitted into the Beatles' inner circle. The unwritten rule, no wives or girlfriends in the studio, was shattered. Yoko was now a constant presence, which fundamentally changed the group's dynamic. It was no longer just four men in a room. This, combined with John's growing disenchantment with the band, made him more creatively withdrawn and passive-aggressive. George Harrison, for his part, was finally developing into a world-class songwriter, but his frustration was at its peak. For years, he had been patronized by the Lennon-McCartney songwriting duo, struggling to get more than one or two songs on each album. Now he was creating some of his best work, such as While My Guitar Gently Weeps, but still felt he had to fight for creative space. And then there was Paul McCartney. With Epstein gone and John disengaged, Paul took on the role of leader. He was the driven workaholic, pushing the others to continue creating. As Ringo himself later admitted, we would not have made as many records if it hadn't have been for Paul. But this intense drive was often perceived by the others as domineering. He became a perfectionist and, critically, started instructing his bandmates exactly what to play. George resented this, and John detested what he called Paul's granny music, leading to explosive arguments. Caught in the middle of all this was Ringo, the emotional compass of the band. He felt the toxic atmosphere more intensely than anyone else. In the anthology documentary, he described the period, "There was no magic, and the relationships were terrible. I'd come to a bad spot in life. I just didn't feel good. I felt like an outsider." He would arrive at the studio on time only to sit for hours waiting for the others. As the music became more disjointed, he often had nothing to do. He felt like a hired session musician, a feeling that had begun during Skatine. Pepper but had now worsened. The most painful slight, however, came from the one person trying to maintain the group's cohesion. Paul McCartney, in his pursuit of perfection, began to critique Ringo's drumming, something he had rarely done since their early days. For a drummer who already felt insecure, this was crushing. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a judgment that made Ringo feel he was not good enough. The easygoing Beatle was being pushed to the brink, and ironically, the person pushing him was the one trying to prevent the band from falling apart. The tension finally reached a climax on August 22, 1968. The band was working on Paul's song, Back in the USSR. It was a high-energy rock and roll track that should have been fun to record, but the mood was anything but. Paul had a very specific vision for the drum part, and Ringo was struggling to execute it exactly as Paul heard it. Paul became increasingly critical of Ringo's playing. For Ringo, who had been feeling unloved and sidelined for weeks, the suggestions became demands. This was the final breaking point. It was about more than just a drum fill. It was about every solitary hour spent waiting, every session where he felt like a hired hand, and every glance that made him feel like an outsider. The incessant bickering, John's detachment, George's frustration, and now Paul's open criticism all hit him at once. He had had enough. In his classic understated style, Ringo did not throw his sticks or yell. He simply stopped, got up from his kit, and quietly walked out. This was not merely a break, it was a resignation. He went to find the others to make his departure official. The story he has recounted many times since is both heartbreaking and absurd. He first went to John, telling him, "I'm leaving the group because I'm not playing well and I feel unloved and out of it, and you three are really close." Expecting a fight, he was stunned by John's reply, "I thought it was you three." Dumbfounded, Ringo went to Paul's house and said the same thing. Paul's response was nearly identical. "I thought it was you three." It was a devastating realization. Ringo recalled the moment on the Howard Stern show, saying after hearing that from both of them, "I said, FK it, I'm off." He didn't even bother going to see George. His feeling of being an outsider was not paranoia, it was real, but each of the other Beatles also felt they were on the outside of a clique that didn't actually exist. And Ringo, believing he was the most isolated of all, simply removed himself from the situation. He told them he was going on vacation, and just like that, the drummer for the Beatles had quit. While the news was kept secret, Ringo immediately escaped the toxic London environment with his wife and children. He borrowed a yacht from his friend, actor Peter Sellers, and sailed for Sardinia. For 2 weeks he was free. He was simply Richard Starkey, a husband and father on holiday. It was here, drifting on the Mediterranean, that creativity was sparked. After lunch, the boat's captain told him that octopuses travel the seabed, collecting stones and shiny objects to construct gardens. Ringo, who felt adrift within the world's biggest band, was captivated by this image of a creature building its own peaceful sanctuary. In that moment of upheaval, he began writing the whimsical song that would become Octopus's Garden. Meanwhile, back at Abbey Road, the other three continued on. For, back in the USSR, the very track that prompted the walkout, Paul McCartney sat behind the drum kit. He later admitted, "I'm sure it pissed Ringo off when he couldn't quite get the drums when I sat in." For their next song, Dear Prudence, Paul played drums again. But while they could technically keep going, the feeling was hollow. The drum riser, the band's physical and sonic core, was empty. The anchor was gone. They could produce music without him, but they were not the Beatles. The chemistry was broken. Ringo's departure proved that his contribution was far more than simply keeping time. He was their foundation. The realization slowly dawned on them. They needed their drummer back. After almost 2 weeks, John, Paul, and George finally reached out. Ringo, still in Sardinia, received a telegram. The message was simple and heartfelt. "You're the best rock and roll drummer in the world. Come on home. We love you." It was precisely what he needed to hear, the validation and affection he had been missing. He decided to return. On September 3, 1968, a nervous Ringo Starr re-entered Abbey Road Studios. What he found was a grand gesture of apology. George Harrison had arranged for his entire drum kit to be covered in red, white, and blue flowers. The tension vanished. "I felt good about myself again," Ringo said in Anthology. "We'd got through that little crisis, and it was great." The walkout, which could have been the beginning of the end, paradoxically strengthened their bond. It forced the other three to confront a truth they had taken for granted. Ringo wasn't just their drummer, he was an irreplaceable part of the band's soul. As Ringo himself later understood, his departure brought the unspoken tensions to the surface. He said, "I realized that we were all feeling like outsiders. It just needed me to go around knocking to bring it to a head." The crisis was over, and the Beatles were a four-man band once again. The story of Ringo's walkout is a powerful reminder that behind the legend, the Beatles were four very real people dealing with immense pressure. Their struggles were part of what made their music so profound. If you enjoy these deep dives into the true stories behind music history, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories you thought you knew. So, did Ringo Starr truly hate Paul McCartney? The answer, of course, is no. There was no deep-seated animosity. It was a moment of profound frustration, a breaking point born from insecurity and the intense pressure of the White Album sessions. His conflict with Paul was not about personal dislike, but a clash of working styles and a desperate need for appreciation. In the decades since, Paul and Ringo have remained incredibly close friends, the last two members of a club no one else can ever truly join. Ringo's 2-week departure was a tremor that signaled the larger earthquake to come. The tensions of the White Album would ultimately lead to the band's final breakup a year and a half later, but it also proved that the Beatles were a delicate ecosystem that needed all four members to function. They were a four-cornered room, and when one corner was removed, the entire structure became unstable. It showed that even the most lovable member of the biggest band on Earth had his limits, reminding us that behind every legendary song, there is a story of struggle, compromise, and a complex, enduring friendship.